by Rob Scott. The subject will be lessons from Lazarus. And in preparation, he's asked if we could read John 11, 1 through 44. John 11, verses 1 to 44. Now a certain man was sick named Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. And it was that Mary was which anointed the Lord with ointment, and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Therefore his sister sent unto him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom thou lovest is sick. When Jesus heard that, he said, This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God might be glorified thereby. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. And when he had heard therefore that he was sick, he abode 2 days still in the same place where he was. Then after that saith he to his disciples, Let us go into Judea again. His disciples say unto him, Master, the Jews of late sought to stone thee, and goest thou thither again? Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If any man walk in the day, he stumbleth not, because he seeth the light of this world. But if a man walk in the night, he stumbleth, because there is no light in him. These things said he, and after that he saith unto them, Our friend Lazarus sleepeth, but I go, that I may wake him out of his sleep. Then said his disciples, Lord, if he sleep, he shall do well. Howbeit Jesus spake of his death, but they thought that he had spoken of taking rest and sleep. Then said Jesus unto them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, to the intent ye may believe. Nevertheless, let us go unto him. Then said Thomas, which is called Didymus, unto his fellow disciples, Let us also go, that we may die with him. Then when Jesus came, he found that he had lain in the grave 4 days already. Now Bethany was nigh unto Jerusalem, about 15 furlongs off. And many of the Jews came to Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. Then Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went and met him, but Mary sat still in the house. Then said Martha unto Jesus, Lord, if thou hadst been there, my brother had not died. But I know that even now, whatsoever thou wilt ask of God, God will give it to thee. Jesus saith unto her, Thy brother shall rise again. Martha said unto him, I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection at the last day. And Jesus said unto her, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Believest thou this? She saith unto him, Yea, Lord, I believe that thou art the Christ, the Son of God, which should come into the world. And when she had so said, she went her way and called Mary her sister secretly, saying, The Master is come and calleth for thee. As soon as she heard that, she arose quickly and came unto him. Now Jesus was not yet come into the town, but was in the place where Martha met him. The Jews then, which were with her in the house, and comforted her, when they saw Mary, that she arose up hastily and went out, followed her, saying, She goeth unto the grave to weep there. And when Mary was come where Jesus was, and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying unto him, Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died. When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews also weeping, which came with her, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled, and said, Where have ye laid him? And they said unto him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. Then said the Jews, Behold, how he loved him. And some of them said, Could not this man which opened the eyes of the blind have caused that even this man should not have died? Jesus therefore again, groaning in himself, cometh to the grave. It was a cave, and a stone lay upon it. Jesus said, Take ye away the stone. And Martha, the sister of him that was dead, saith unto him, Lord, by this time he stinketh, for he hath been dead 4 days. Jesus said unto her, Said I not unto thee, that if thou wouldest believe, thou shouldest see the glory of God? Then they took away the stone from the place where the dead was laid. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank thee that thou hast heard me. And I knew that thou hearest me always, but because of the people which stand by I said it, that they may believe that thou hast sent me. And when he had thus spoken, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And he that was dead came forth, and bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was bound about with a napkin. And Jesus saith unto him, Loose him, and let him go. Now I'd like to turn our attention to Brother Rob Scott, and his exhortation is Lessons from Lazarus.
Good morning, everyone. So Lazarus is one of my favorite stories from the life of Jesus. It's among probably the most miraculous that we hear of, although most of the things that he did were pretty miraculous. This one kind of is a notch above the others. My goal and my purpose for my words today, we're going to just do a quick study of the events and the characters that participated in this miracle of Jesus. My hope is that we can get a good perspective of the different individuals, their faith, their lack of faith, and the emotions that everyone in this situation was going through. I hope we can learn the role this miracle not only played in shaping the spiritual lives of those who saw this occasion, but something that I kind of learned when I was doing this talk is really this helped shape Jesus's walk towards his final destiny on the cross. And I never really thought about it with regard to how it affected Jesus, but I think this is a significant in that, and I hope I can share that with you in a way that's clear. And then finally, we'll look at how we can, how this account can shape our beliefs and our faith as we examine how the Apostle Paul elaborates in another one of my favorite chapters, 1 Corinthians 15, regarding sleep and the resurrection and the kingdom age. So with that, you will not see an expert display of PowerPointism, but you will see my PowerPoint. I guess this top button is the one that advances the slide. Okay. The on button. Here we go. All right, let's see here. Anything? Oh, wait, that's the pointer. Okay. So the arrow is what moves it. There we go. Okay. My tutorial is over. Maybe I should have done that before I got up here, but anyway, we'll move on. So lessons from Lazarus. Here are the questions and thoughts that I want to consider today as we go through this. One, who was Lazarus? Why did Jesus wait to go see Lazarus and his sisters that were mourning? Compare the faith of Martha and the faith of Mary. We'll talk a little bit about what we know about Martha and Mary. And what is the significance of Jesus wept? That always struck me because it was hard to, I always wondered why Jesus wept. And so I want to talk about that. And then relate this to our hope. And then we'll look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and kind of pull some verses out of that chapter with regard to resurrection of the dead, the kingdom age, and how things will happen then. Okay? So our first question, who was Lazarus? So he was the brother of Martha and Mary and the one that Jesus loved. So in verse 11 that Brother Caleb read for us said, now the man Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Martha and her sister, or the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. So brother to Martha and Mary. And Martha and Mary were mentioned together in a previous account in Luke chapter 10 and Mark 14. And we'll read a little bit about those later when we talk about Martha and Mary specifically. We see a couple of times that Jesus loved Lazarus. So verse 36, after Jesus wept, the people watching say, behold, look how he loved them. And then in verse 5 of chapter 11, it says, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So we know Jesus clearly knew them and loved them. This wasn't an acquaintance's son, or, a lot of times Jesus didn't even know the person he was helping per se intimately. He just he took mercy on who he took mercy on, and it wasn't someone that he knew specifically. So, I guess the first question that our human minds would ask, were these selfish motives by Jesus? Was he doing this because it was his friend and he didn't want his friend to be dead? And I think we'll see clearly that that wasn't the case. So moving forward, why did Jesus wait? So he explains this to his disciples. In verse 11, he said, after he had said this, he went to them. Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up. And then skipping down to verse 14, it says, so he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. So let us go to him. So the clear reason for his waiting is so that you may believe. So that was a key point in why he waited to go see Lazarus. If we think about Jesus's ministry up to this point chronologically, I won't pull it up, but just a chapter previously, in chapter 4, Jesus had healed the royal official's son, who was made better without Jesus being present. He told him that his son was made well, and if you remember, he walked back on the way back, and the servant met him and said, your son got better yesterday. He said, well, what time? He said, well, 1 p.m. And he remembered that was exactly the time that Jesus had told him that his son was better. So Jesus had already healed and done things without being present. So we're clear, and he'd also healed people and done things up to this point where we knew that Jesus was capable of affecting change even without being present. So his hands weren't tied in any way. So I think it's a lot like us is, let's move forward actually. So other reasons for waiting. So skipping down to the portion of this chapter in verse 39 where he actually raised Lazarus from the dead. He says in verse 39, take away the stone. The Lord said, but Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there's a bad odor, for he has been there for 4 days. So here's another reason that I kind of thought of that was a good reason why Jesus waited, was Jesus rose after only 3 days. So this was to kind of help build the faith that Lazarus will have been in the ground even longer than Jesus himself will be in the ground. And so he's been predicting his death, predicting that he'll rise again on the 3rd day. And so hopefully them seeing Lazarus arise after 4 days will give them the indication that, they needed a sign. And so I think, and then, I'll venture into the morbid for only a moment and say that by the 4th day of death, the enzymes in our bodies kind of take over our bodies, and it creates these gases that are released. And so therefore, by day 4, they're right. And when they say the body would stink. So there's no question about the validity of whether or not Lazarus is dead and gone. He's not sleeping. He's not in a coma. This is clearly a dead person that they're dealing with. And you think about, you hear over and over, the Jews need a sign, or you need a sign, or you of little faith. And Jesus is very kind in giving them what they need so that they can stay faithful to the course of Jesus's life and the course it'll take. He gives them these things to strengthen their faith. And Brother Brad Ricks a couple of weeks ago gave us a great example of what we have to strengthen our faith, and that's the witness of the nation of Israel. So there are things that God has given us that we can witness. The disciples clearly couldn't have seen the unfolding of the nation of Israel to the extent that we have. So they got to witness firsthand this resurrection and these miracles. And now we have this book filled with these accounts. And then we have our real life surrounding us of what's happening with the nation of Israel. So we need signs too. And I think I would love to say that without signs, I would believe the way God would have me to believe. But if it weren't for the witness of the nation of Israel and for the things that God has given us to strengthen our faith, I don't know where my faith would be. So the same thing, in his mercy, God and Jesus provide these signs. So the next subject we'll talk about is the faith of Mary and Martha. Okay? So Mary, she was the one who used valuable perfume to anoint Jesus and was commended by Jesus despite being criticized by those witnessing. So in Luke 7:37, we read, a woman in that town who had lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there, So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. And then skipping down to verse 47, Jesus says, therefore I tell you, because, we know from the account that after this, they say, this perfume was valuable. Why is she wasting this perfume like that? This is part of our thing of value that we could use for food or to feed the poor. So why is she wasting it? So they're criticizing her. She's an easy target. She's a woman who had lived a sinful life. So Jesus says, therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little. So I think this one needs balancing. It needed balancing for me when I read it. And this is my take on that. And that is, what does it mean the more that we've sinned, the more that we love? Does it mean because we've lived a sinful life and we've come back from a sinful life, then we have more love than someone who hasn't sinned as much? And I think, I think a quick read of that could convince you maybe. But when you think about it, it's the more we realize we've been forgiven, the more we love. And all of us have been forgiven of much. And she knew how much she had been forgiven of. The Pharisees, those witnessing this account, maybe they didn't think they had anything to be forgiven of. And I think that's the error we fall into, is if we have the humility to know that all of us have been immensely forgiven for a multitude of sins, that's why we love more. And that's why we forgive others, because we've been forgiven and we love more because of that. So that's the purpose of that statement, I think. And it has nothing to do with a count of how many sins you've committed as with regard to how much you love as a result. It's really the humility of knowing that you've been forgiven, I think, is what he meant there. And then we know that Mary, and another account, which I'll read real quick, is in Luke chapter 10, verses 38 through 41. So Luke chapter 10, 38 through 41 says, and this is the account where they go to, where Jesus visits her house. It says, now it happened as they went that he entered a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, who also sat at Jesus' feet and heard his word. But Martha was distracted with much serving, and she approached him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Therefore, tell her to help me. And Jesus answered and said to her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and troubled about many things, but one thing is needed, and Mary has chosen that good part, which will not be taken away from her. So, in these previous two occasions, Mary, I don't think Martha was doing anything wrong, except that she criticized her sister for wanting to hear what Jesus had to say. I think Martha was being Martha. She was doing what she thought was necessary to make sure that she was being a virtuous woman that, was preparing a meal and doing what she thought was right. But she didn't understand the perspective of her sister, Mary, who was taking full advantage of the presence of Jesus and wanted to be there to hear every word that he said, and wasn't really as worried about the preparations. So So again, a little bit of background about these two. So Martha, again, she criticized her sister for not helping and listening to Jesus instead. But on this particular occasion, if we look back at the chapter that was read for us, John 11, of course, we see that she seems to be the one that shows more faith. From an outside look, you would say that she was probably more faithful. So starting in verse 20, it said, "Now Martha, as soon as she had heard that Jesus was coming, went out and met him, but Mary was sitting in the house. Now Martha said to Jesus, 'Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But now, even now, I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you.' And Jesus said to her, 'Your brother will rise again.' Martha said to him, 'I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day.' Jesus said to her, 'I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?' She said to him, 'Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who has come into the world.'" So in this particular instance, Martha was much more faithful. Mary stayed at home. Maybe Mary's state of mind was in a different place than Martha's was. Martha truly believed. I think the biggest thing is that Martha believed that even though Lazarus was dead, that Jesus could still raise him. Even now, she says, that I know even now you can do whatever you ask of God will happen. So she had a very large amount of faith that this was going to happen. So what does this reveal about our faith? And I would say the answer is consistency, and it's refreshing because it shows that Mary wasn't always perfect in her faith, and neither was Martha always perfect in her faith. And it's a lot like us. There's different times in our life and different trials in our life and different situations that we handle differently. And we all have different backgrounds and experiences that equip us to handle things with or without faith. And that's why we have this work in progress, that God works with us to strengthen us, to make us the faithful servants that he would have us to be. Because there's no one of us that would be faithful in every situation. We have different people in our body that are faithful about different things that can provide that strength, again, based on their experience and based on what they've been through. We don't know a lot about the life of Martha, but we do know that Mary was a sinner. She was someone who had lived a life of sin and had come to find Jesus and felt redeemed. And so maybe Martha had a deeper understanding of who Jesus was in terms of the long-term plan of what Jesus was there to accomplish. And maybe Mary just saw Jesus as, her answer to the forgiveness of her sins, and she still needed to grow in certain ways. Of course, this is all speculation, but I'm just trying to kind of make it real for us that we're all different people with different weaknesses and strengths. The next portion I wanted to talk about is Jesus wept. Okay, so looking at verse 33, it says, when Jesus saw her weeping, or let's start at actually verse 32. It says, I didn't write that on my notes here. It says, then when Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. So that'll make you feel good, wouldn't it? Especially when your disciples are standing right beside you and they know you've intentionally waited to get there. And then you see this woman mourning at his feet, my brother would not have died. And then in verse 33, it says, when Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. And he said, where have you laid him? Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. So what do we know about Jesus? So here's one from Hebrews chapter 4. It says, therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Again, we think a lot about the witnesses to this resurrection of Lazarus, the people who were there, and that it was for them, and certainly it was for them. Jesus even says it was for them. But think of the impact this also had on Jesus. Jesus, at this point, experiences firsthand the effects of what our sinful state leads to, what our mortality leads to. And he saw the effects of this. I don't think he was crying because Lazarus was dead. He was crying because he was witnessing the grief of others that they were experiencing, and seeing that pain and feeling that pain, and knowing that without him doing what he was going to do on the cross, this state would continue with mankind, that there would be no hope without what he was going to do for mankind. So I think that was the power of why he wept, because he was tempted in every way. He also needed to experience human emotion. He was a human, but there was nothing short-sighted about Jesus's experience on this earth that he didn't get to experience and grow from on the way to doing what he had to do. He wasn't programmed to do anything. He had to make choices, and he had to prioritize based on what he saw. And I think God provided this experience for Jesus as much as Jesus provided this experience for his disciples, in that it helped strengthen him and further his course towards that cross. If we look at verse 38, it says, "Then Jesus, again groaning in himself, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, 'Take away the stone.'" Does that sound familiar to anybody? Does that sound like where Jesus was buried? I really think that Jesus had to have thought when he went to this place that this is where he would one day lie. And he was a human being, and none of us want to die. None of us are ready to die. Even though we have a wonderful hope, we don't hope to die today so we can experience it. We want to experience that hope in God's time, and we have faith of that hope. But Jesus, at this tomb where there's a stone laid in front of it, he's still groaning in himself. And I know why, because I think he's seeing this tomb where he's going to lie, because Jesus knew what was in store for him. So I hope that so let's look at the hope, and we see this and what Jesus and God will do versus what they were witnessing at this point. So Revelation 7 verses 16 and 17 says, "They shall neither hunger anymore nor thirst anymore. The sun shall not strike them, nor any heat. For the Lamb who is in the midst of the throne will shepherd them and lead them to living fountains of waters, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes." In the same book of Revelation, chapter 21, verse 4, "And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away." So that's the contrast of what Jesus was experiencing at this time and what's going to come at the return of Jesus and what will be fulfilled. So to close, I want to, if we'll all just flip over, please, to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. I was going to get Caleb to read that whole chapter too, but I gave him a break. But it's a very long chapter, and I've picked out some verses that I would just like to kind of skip through this chapter and answer some of these questions that maybe that were left unanswered by the account with Lazarus. So some remarks before we get into that. It says, Jesus, throughout his ministry, showed his ability to perform miracles with regard to bringing the dead back to life, healing the sick, in the account we've just examined, raising someone who is not only dead, but buried and well into the stages of death. While this was such a powerful example to those who were fortunate enough to witness this event, or hear from a trusted friend that witnessed the event, what about those who would later hear about this and still have questions about what happens to us when we die and when Jesus returns? When do we arise? What body will we be given? Who will rule this kingdom? The Apostle Paul gives us these great inspired answers in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. So we'll look at that in closing, and I'm just going to highlight some of the different answers that I really feel like this chapter gives us. If I can get my paperwork straight here. There we go. So 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the first verse I wanted to look at. Verse 1. Moreover, brethren, I declare to you the gospel which I preached to you, which you also received, in which you stand, by which also you are saved, if you hold fast that word I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. So the things he's about to tell the audience, and this is the ecclesia at Corinth, is that this is gospel. These are the things that are pertaining to the kingdom of God in the name of Jesus Christ. So basically he's saying, listen up. Verse 3 says, for I delivered to you first of all that which I also received, that Jesus Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the scriptures. So Jesus died and was buried on the third day. I think most people wouldn't have called themselves Christians yet at this point if they didn't at least believe that part, that Jesus died. Some of them maybe had some lack of understanding about the resurrection, and we'll read about that. Skipping down to verse 12, it says, now if Christ is preached that he has been risen from the dead, how do some among you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? But if there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christ is not risen. And if Christ is not risen, then our preaching is empty and your faith is also empty. So if Jesus isn't risen, then we have no hope. So we need to understand and know that Jesus Christ has risen from the dead. Skipping down to verse 16, it says, for if the dead do not rise, then Jesus is not risen. So it goes hand in hand both ways. And if Christ is not risen, your faith is futile and you are still in your sins. Okay? So what happens when we're raised? Verse 20, but now Christ is risen from the dead and has become the firstfruits of those who have fallen asleep. So those who have died, just like Jesus described Lazarus, he had fallen asleep. He was waiting the resurrection from the dead by Jesus Christ when he established his kingdom. That was the state that Lazarus was in. He was not risen to immortality. He was just risen to live out however long the rest of his life was. And I think most of us would agree on that. So again, Jesus has become the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. So no one has risen to immortality except Jesus. He is the first fruits. And then when he returns, so it says, for since by man came death, by man also came the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ all shall be made alive, but each one in his own order. Christ the first fruits, and afterwards those who are Christ at his coming. So when Jesus returns, he will raise those who have fallen asleep. Our next question. So what is our hope? Our next question is, what body will we be raised with? Then the other question is, who will rule this kingdom, and then what? So if we skip down to verse 24, it says, then comes the end, when he delivers the kingdom to God the Father. So when Jesus comes, he establishes his kingdom. Verse 24, he delivers the kingdom to God the Father, when he puts an end to all rule and all authority and all power. For he must rule till he has put all enemies under his feet. The last enemy that will be destroyed is death. So his kingdom will be established, but not everyone in this kingdom will be immortal yet. The last enemy that will be destroyed is death. Those verses from Revelation that we read, this is where all death, all dying, all sorrow, all tears have been eliminated. Verse 28 says, now when all things are made subject to him, then the Son himself will also be subject to him who put all things under him, that God may be all in all. So Jesus will establish this kingdom, and in the end, God will rule it, and God will be all and in all. And that's been God's purpose from the beginning, that all people would glorify his name. The other question is, what body will we be raised with? So if we skip down to verse 35, it's asked that same question. For someone will say, how are the dead raised up, and with what body do they come? That's verse 35. So if we skip down to verse 42, it says, so also is the resurrection of the dead. The body is sown in corruption, it is raised in incorruption. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. There is a natural body and there is a spiritual body. And so it is written, the first man Adam became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. So the last Adam, as we could study that extensively, but the last Adam is Jesus Christ, that he was able to do what Adam was not able to do. However, verse 46 tells us, the spiritual is not first, but the natural, and afterwards the spiritual. Okay? So, in closing, I'd like to read starting at verse 51 through verse 55. And this kind of encapsulates our great hope. It says, behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. For this corruption must put on incorruption, and this mortal must put on immortality. So when this corruptible has put on incorruption, and this mortal has put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your sting? O Hades, where is your victory? So as we go out into our week, let our faith be assured, because God has revealed his great plan for us through his Son, Jesus Christ. Thank you.